You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, I'm Chris Coyne, the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And today I am joined with Michael Romero, who is a professor of economics and business at Thales College. Michael, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here.
It's great to speak with you. We are going to be discussing your paper, which is co-authored with my colleague, Virgil Storr. And the title of the paper is Markets as a Peace Lab. And this is part of a broader special issue that we're doing on the work of Kenneth Boulding. Your paper with Virgil makes it a fascinating contribution to that issue because it focuses on the role of markets in a way we don't normally think about them necessarily, which is as a key contributor to a broader stable peace. And so let me start with a very broad question, which is to discuss your thesis in broad terms and to say a little bit about how you see it fitting in with Kenneth Boulding's scholarship as it pertains to peace.
So, the core thesis is that markets, these spaces that we regularly engage in, whether we're buying consumer products or we're selling services, employing our labor or being an employer ourselves as an entrepreneur, whenever we're engaged in this commercial activity, we are essentially engaging in what we can think of as a laboratory for peace. These are everyday spaces where we experiment with peaceful interaction. The market, by its nature, at least if we're following certain rules of just conduct, we're respecting one another's property rights and our freedom to buy and sell from whom we please, we are in effect cultivating habits of peacefulness, habitual behavior where we are engaged peacefully with people that we know, strangers who we've never met before. And through that, we get firsthand evidence. We get empirical evidence that peace works, that peace helps us accomplish our goals, that engaging in commerce also enables other people to accomplish their goals. And we get a sense for the cooperation and interdependence that is characteristic of the market. And so, building on Kenneth Boulding's scholarship, I'd say this paper highlights that beyond perhaps the more structural factors that he emphasized, thinking about social systems, thinking about how we're integrated in different social systems, beyond his focus on these images that we have of ourselves and of others that we interact with and how that shapes our interactions, and beyond conflict resolution practices, which is something he focuses on. Peace also requires personal beliefs. Peace also requires that we reflect on the possibility for peaceful association and that we experience it firsthand, that we actively are believing in peace. And so markets provide, well, they repeatedly demonstrate that cooperation with strangers is possible without violence. Cooperation with strangers does not require force. It doesn't require a third party government authority to kind of oversee it. It can be bottom up and mutual between, at minimum, just two individuals. And markets create the condition for what we term an active, stable peace. Just as a scientist might run repeated trials under certain controlled conditions to show that a hypothesis holds up, market participants likewise engage in a certain activity under conditions of property, under conditions of prices, and a rule of law to demonstrate that peaceful cooperation reliably generates mutual prosperity.
Thank you for that. So this is fascinating because it gives us a much more nuanced and I would say richer conception of how markets operate beyond some kind of narrow, kind of efficiency focused understanding of markets, which might be quite important in and of itself, but it certainly doesn't capture the whole story. So this isn't just about scarce resources moving around to their highest valued use. There is that going on. But what you and Virgil really hammer home is that there's both social relationships on the front end in order to have those interactions between what we call buyers and sellers or suppliers and demanders, but that those interactions also cultivate and enhance and contribute to the evolution of social relationships as well. And so that's one of the aspects that I find fascinating with your papers, this broader conception of learning and experimentation. In your response to my question, you made reference to this term active stable peace that you and Virgil invoke. And I want to ask you to say a little bit more about what that entails. And let me frame it like this. Many conceptions of peace focus on the absence of violence. So if there's no violence being observed, then that's peace. And there's something to that. I understand that conception, it resonates with me. But again, when I read your paper, one of the things that stands out to me is that you're emphasizing that understanding peace is more than just the absence of violence. There's something else involved in its both creation and its maintenance through time. And so can you talk a little bit more about your conception of active stable peace and how it differs from merely the absence of violence?
So the key term that we're kind of building off of is Kenneth Boulding's notion of a stable piece. And a stable piece can be a consequence of just merely a lack of war. So there could be a far off remote island that never engages with your nation state or your people or your economy. And you're technically at peace, but you also don't regularly engage or interact with those people, whether it's socially or economically. And so an active stable peace is not just the lack of war, but it's a condition where people routinely and deliberately engage in peaceful interactions, often across borders. And so it has like an international component to it. It involves trust. So trusting somebody from another nation. Maybe this is a supplier that you never really meet with on a face-to-face basis, but you realize that they provide a high quality steel input, let's say, and you're manufacturing barbecue grills from a business in China. You gain a certain trust and reliability in that business, regardless of their political designation or their geographic designation. It becomes economically almost meaningless. There's sort of a mutual belief that you get from that in the ability for peace to work and the efficacy of peace to help us both accomplish our goals. So in contrast to merely the absence of violence, which might be based on apathy or habit. And this is something that Boulding emphasizes. He says, like, you can something along the lines of you can basically measure how much peace is in the world by how much dust is on the war plans, or like just people being lazy and not wanting to have to actually make war. Like there's a certain, it's almost easier just to be at peace and to be closed off from people that are different than you. And so our argument tries to build on this by claiming that markets offer a context where people practice active peace daily. So they're making choices, they're negotiating, they're coming to agreements, they're resolving conflicts, and they're doing all of those things non-violently. And so that's sort of the way that I think we make sense of that term in this paper.
That makes perfect sense. It's interesting. So I like that the dust on the plains and the laziness point regarding war you raised. We usually, of course, think of laziness as not being productive, but this perhaps is a form of laziness that is productive, not engaging in destruction, is allows for productive acts. One of the things I want to just mention that you mentioned in your last response, which I again you have these several great terms, and this is another one. You brought up borders, cross-border interactions, And you said something like, well, it makes them almost economically meaningless, the borders themselves, I mean. And that's a fascinating thing. So let me try to ask you to expand on that in this context. In that, going back to your first response, okay, markets offer opportunities for people to experiment with peace. And you've given us with the steel manufacturer, you gave us a couple related examples of how that might interact. Can you highlight any other ways that market interactions, buying goods and services, sometimes even in the most mundane interactions, foster these habits of peacefulness, teach individual skills of peacefulness, and contribute to this active, stable peace that you were just telling us about?
I think one example that comes to mind is something I just experienced a couple weeks ago. My wife and I were considering replacing some of our windows. And so we had a window salesman come over and he actually brought a window in and he was explaining it. And then when it came time to discuss the price, he gave a quote and an estimate. We were able to negotiate with him. We were able to get a slightly lower price, and well, we made an initial offer, told him kind of where we'd like to be, and then he came back with another price, and we were able to kind of meet in the middle. And I think that that instance of price negotiation instead of force, instead of coercion, or instead of me maybe lobbying my local government and saying that the window prices are too high for me, so we should have a rule that says you can't charge above a certain price. We were able to come to an agreement, and I'm sure that that window installer, that salesman, he comes to an agreement on a case by case basis, depending on what features you want and what your preferences are from customer to customer. And so I think that that teaches compromise. It teaches skills in persuasion and also respect for the other person's will or respect for the other person's position. I think customer service and common courtesy is another example that I regularly experience where when you're interacting in the market, there's almost an orientation to provide good customer service. It doesn't always occur, but at least it seems to be the norm where your success depends on anticipating and meeting the needs of your customers. And I think through that, you cultivate a sort of empathy and you're able to kind of situate yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so, restaurant servers, like my first job was working at In N Out Burger in California. And we had a sort of a standard that said the customer is always right. And it wasn't that they're technically correct always, because sometimes customers would complain about things and I knew that they were wrong. But there's almost an attitude of courtesy where you don't engage in fighting. You don't come back with a rebuttal. You slow down a bit and you're calm and you collect yourself. And I think that in other industries beyond food service, even in retail or Uber drivers, there's a certain common courtesy, and I think that other types of market mechanisms like Yelp, for instance, help support that, where we have reviews and feedback, or even something like the Better Business Bureau, which I don't know much about, but my sense is that they have ratings that people can look to or report to. Contracts and trust. I think signing a lease if you're going to rent property, or maybe you're going to get a mortgage. That's a peaceful way of resolving the use of living space. There might otherwise be a conflict. Well, there is a conflict in the sense that there's other people that might be bidding on that house, but at least the way in which we resolve it is peaceful. We resolve it through bids and offers and coming to a contract, which can help formalize our expectations without resorting to force, without me trying to attack the other people that might be bidding on the home or might be doing a or try to sabotage their what's it called when you tour a house when you're coming in to see the house. There's a few other things that come to mind that I guess I'll just mention briefly. There's this idea that, like I mentioned, institutional mechanisms. So I think we can think of Yelp or review platforms in general as an institution of the market that facilitates good behavior and that people have a certain reputational capital on the line, and it's in their interest. They have an incentive to do so. But I think in doing so, there's a real value in understanding that you're providing really valuable outputs and products for people and making a difference in their lives. Another example of concrete ways that the market might foster peace is that with cross-cultural exchange, I think when we interact with sellers from around the world, whether it's through a platform like Etsy, where we've bought I think a kitchen sink before, and apparently in Egypt there's a really good work that's done on certain types of metal like brass, and maybe the only opportunity I would have to interact with an Egyptian seller was through Etsy, and he was really nice and courteous. And we actually had an issue with one of the components, and he was quick to respond and helped us clarify it. So I think just interacting with people from other nations gives you a sense that they're not really that different than yourself. And I think we can conjure up these images of international people being a lot different, but then when we meet people from places we've never been, we realize that we're actually quite similar in certain ways. I think lastly, there's a certain common courtesy in small interactions, saying thank you when you receive something or when you have good service, maybe you tip. These are sort of like these micro level practices of civil discourse and association that I think can really add up into cultures of peace.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Two things that stood out to me in addition to your comments. One is just so much how we interact with people. All of us have the ability to turn small things into bigger things if we choose to. What got me thinking about this is your comment about your customers at your first job. Sometimes they're wrong, and customers can be polite or rude when there's an issue, and that matters a great deal. But you mentioned with sellers kind of responding to customers. In my experience, again, there's rude people in the world no matter what. We never avoid that. We can decide how we want to respond to people being rude to us. But customers are oftentimes quite polite as well. Go back to your example about your windows and negotiating. There's cultural norms about what's appropriate and insulting other people. So I wasn't there for your window negotiations, but I doubt you said, "How about I pay you $0 for that and you install Windows?" Probably because you realize that would be odd and insulting to the person, and so I'm guessing your starting counter was something that you thought was reasonable, but you also assume they might find reasonable or at least not insulting. And so these human interactions that you and Virgil highlight are really important, which leads me to my next question. Kenneth Boulding had this idea of the taboo line regarding human behavior and this line between the kind of vision, if you will, of people between peacefully navigating things and violently navigating them. And there's taboo behaviors, he said, that force violence into either smaller or larger segments of our imagination because it's either considered a legitimate form of action or not. Violence, that is. And so, talk a little bit about your conception of the taboo line in your paper with Virgil and how it relates to the point you were just making about market activities and the kind of learning environment of markets.
Yeah, the taboo line is Bolding's concept of the boundary between what is physically possible, and among what is physically possible, what types of actions are socially acceptable. So there's like a wide set of physically possible things we could do in any circumstance, but there's a subset of responses that are socially acceptable or legitimate. And the market shifts that taboo line by making violence and coercion taboo within commercial interactions, which is opposite during times of war. So if you're at war during World War II, for example, there's horrific stories that soldiers would tell of things that they did or things that their enemy did to them that would be entirely unacceptable in any other in other circumstances. And I think that it's the taboo line. We can think about it as the impact that markets have on the taboo line is that commerce, the more we have commerce as our means of social organization, as opposed to force and war making, it makes coercion and violence an appropriate response to a shrinking range of potential conflicts. And so the more we engage in commerce, the more we're going to use peace to resolve conflicts because conflicts are going to inevitably arise given scarcity and our separate goals. But that's going to change if we have markets to rely on. And understood in terms of maybe an image you have of yourself or your nation, the way that Boulding thinks about it is the taboo line divides the things the self image permits to be done from the things it does not permit it to be done. And I think there's also an element of you having a certain identity when you're interacting with others of being a good, respectable deli owner or providing really high quality service. It's the sort of image that you want to live up to. And I think a lot of those images in the marketplace are necessarily peaceful and they have to be peaceful for your own success.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so in closing up here, are and you've touched upon this in your prior answers, but I want to ask you if you have any closing thoughts. Given your argument about the role of markets as laboratories for the cultivation of peace, are there any other broad implications for thinking about fostering a more peaceful world? Any other thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of economic education, there my sense is that there needs to be a better understanding of how much of our daily goods and services require inputs and resources from around the world. And just because it says it's made in China or made in this region doesn't mean that that everything is involved there. It's an interdependent economy, and so I think teaching that interdependence really illustrates the piece that we already engage in but we don't even recognize. And I also think that explaining terms like trade deficits or just having a basic understanding of mutually beneficial exchange could be important to making people realize the peaceful consequences of markets. I also think there's implications in terms of maybe institutional changes that we can make or changes to current government policies or rhetoric. I think a change towards expanding commerce and free markets that transcend national borders, lowering barriers to exchange that can foster global conditions of active, stable peace. And it can also, thinking in Bolding terms, it can reduce the strain on integrative systems when conflict does arise. It doesn't lead to war, but it leads to maybe things like international commercial arbitration, or maybe it leads to negotiations instead of a first response to fight. And so that those are just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, because it really highlights and drives home how these small, seemingly mundane interactions between people and markets scale up, broadcast out, reach across borders, and contribute to a broader, stable peace. So I appreciate it. Michael, I want to thank you for joining me today. The paper we discussed is Markets as a Peace Lab, and it's co-authored by Michael Romero and Virgil Storr. It's part of a special issue of the Review of Austrian Economics on Kenneth Boulding. And Michael, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, Chris.
I have the pleasure today of being joined by my colleague, Dr. Mikayla Novak, who is a senior fellow with the FA Hayek program. Mikayla, thank you so much for being with me today and talking about your paper.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. It's such an honor to talk to you as always.
Yes, yes, this is going to be great. We are talking about your paper, Kenneth Boulding's The Image, a cognitive basis for peace entrepreneurship. And we're going to unpack the different elements that constitute your title. This is of a broader special issue of the Review of Austrian Economics on Kenneth Boulding's thought that we are putting together. So let's jump right into it. Your paper finds its core grounding in Boulding's book, The Image, which was published in 1956. And I wanted to ask you to begin by providing our listeners with an understanding of what Boulding meant by the word image and why this conception, which is bound up with subjective knowledge, is so important for understanding human behavior.
Oh, excellent question. Thank you very much, Chris. So, as you just indicated, Boulding published a very important work called The Image, the subtitle called Knowledge of Life and Society. And he actually provides several definitions of the image in his book. And what he also does, and it's very accessible for any intelligent layperson to read, he goes to very great lengths to actually provide examples of mental images. So it's a very useful book, even for people who are unacquainted with, let's say, the intellectual fineries and nuances of cognitive psychology or the sociology of knowledge. So an image in Balding's account is essentially a mental representation that is developed within the human mind, a concept that bears similarities with neuroscientific notions of cognitive schemes or socio-psychological beliefs, frames, propositions, or understandings. So even casual self-reflection will tell us that human beings cognitively carry within their minds numerous representations, in other words, images in the plural. And Balding says, and I discuss this in my paper, that each person possesses a variety of typically intersecting mental images which bear spatial, temporal, and relational attributes, as well as applying to physical and abstract phenomena. Different people are prone to cognitively carry different images. Now, that's an obvious point, but I think nonetheless very important. So, I should probably say just a couple of words about the similarities between Balding's work and that of Friedrich Hayek, 1952. Hayek published an important book called The Sensory Order, an inquiry into the foundations of theoretical psychology. Now, one key difference is that Balding didn't provide an intensively conceptual or abstract psychological account as did Hayek, but there are actually some very important similarities in their approaches, which would be interesting to Austrian economists and other scholars in mainline political economy. So Hayek, in his book, he offered a neural network approach to human cognition. And one also sees a network structure of cognitive images, as Balding would see it. In other words, different kinds of images reside within one's mind, and they can be connected in all kinds of nested complex ways, depending on the environmental circumstances in which a person finds themselves. So, at least as important as this point is that both Hayek and Balding are critical of the stimulus response orientation of psychological behavioralists, which was a very predominant set of ideas, especially during the first half of the 20th century. Now, the implication of this is that the images that reside in the mind are not perfect replications of events and goings on throughout the external environment, but a representation of such things that are cognitively reshaped and winnowed by such factors as one's past experiences, one normative judgments, and so on. So there are some key similarities between Hayek and Balding, which make both of them very interesting to an Austrian economist. So about the question of subjectivity, it is interesting that Balding actually challenges objectivist accounts of value and how value is basically rendered in the mind. So toward the back of his book, Balding has this fascinating discussion between the age-old distinction between fact and value. And as Balding put it, we conventionally appraise that, let's say, facts are objective in nature, whereas values are subjective. But as Balding says, the theory of the image, and I'm just quoting from his book here, is distinctly unfriendly to the position that facts and values are quite distinct, that facts are a proper subject for scientific study, whereas values are not. He goes on to say that the processes pertaining to the cognitive buildup of factual and valuation images are essentially similar. He says that by far the greater part of our image of fact is built up from symbolic messages from some transcript or from some teacher. Even images as factual as our images of space and time, for instance, that is of geography and history, are built up almost entirely from symbolic images. Then Balding goes on to say that, for example, for most people in this world, the image of, let's say, my home country, Australia, he says, is a fact that is built up entirely by symbolic messages. So you see this sort of blurring of the objective into something that's highly subjective. So in the end, I think Balding has a very interesting sort of cognitive sort of framework in which he is saying that people build up images in their minds that don't just receive the world as given, but they're rather constantly and critically reappraised and reframed in our minds as images. And so, what's actually crucial to understand about Balding's framework, I think, is that these set of mental images are not replicants of the external environment, but they're actually also intersubjectively formulated because humans are able to communicate the representations in their minds with other people. So here's an intersubjective sort of orientation to the image. Balding said in his book that part of our image of the world is the belief that this image is shared by other people like ourselves who are part of our image in the world. But the intersubjectivity doesn't necessarily imply a sense of perfect alignment of images among multiple people. So the subjective element does remain applicable. As Balding said, the construction of knowledge, even public knowledge, is unlikely to lead to the formation, let alone the maintenance of the exact same image for every agent. Individuals ultimately remain individuals with unique capacities and the means to cognitively generate images, even when it comes to comprehending the myriads of social arrangements that humans concoct. So, subjective knowledge is critical to understanding human behavior and action. And that's arguably the fulcrum of Austrian economics as a distinctive approach to inquiry. While there are key biological foundations coupled with normative commitments that give rise to the idea that human beings are much the same, such a statement does not imply homogeneity. Austrian economists recognize that individuals have different and subjectively appraised preferences, tastes, expectations, and motivations, and that these differences are a driving force behind market based material prosperity. So, divergent and oftentimes idiosyncratic knowledge then is posited to give rise to entrepreneurship, including the Kuznerian conception of entrepreneurial alertness to economic opportunities. And I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that cognitive psychological matters probably play some role in the formulation of subjective knowledge that both informs and fuels the market process. On this score, I'm reminded of a quote from Gerald Driscoll and Murray Rizzo in a 1985 book, who once wrote that entrepreneurial discovery is a creative, spontaneous, and to a certain extent idiosyncratic mental act that goes beyond the mere apprehension of objective data. I think Balding would thoroughly agree with this. And as I argued in my paper in the Review of Austrian Economics, Balding's ideas, I think, can help us uncover a new function of entrepreneurship resting in the generation and modification of mental images that subsequently provide a spur for productive economic action. I'm happy to discuss that further as we go on.
Well, thank you so much. That is a wonderful number one, and a wonderful overview of Balding in the image, but I love the connection you make there with Hayek as well. Not just because I agree with the connection, but because I think it shows the relationship between how Balding was thinking about the world and Hayek as well, but also some interesting perhaps differences as well. That I just want to mention for listeners that 1985 book by Mario Rizzo and Gerald O'Driscoll, that's The Economics of Time and Ignorance, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, just for listeners, pardon me, who might be interested in following up on that fascinating quote that you provided us. I want to now continue down this line of thinking that you've laid out for us. So let's talk more about this idea of entrepreneurship and peace. You call it peace entrepreneurship in the title of your paper, but let's delve into this a little more. So, your setup here has opened the door to the possibility of viewing an entrepreneur or the entrepreneur as a category of actor, as someone who can shape, create, revise images. That's in addition to the way that economists, Austrian and others, often think about it as an actor in the market environment, even though they're still in the market environment, but they're serving a slightly different role, perhaps. So I want to ask you to expound upon that. But then, if you would, talk a little bit about how that then subsequently provides insight into how entrepreneurs can serve this role as peace entrepreneurs, as contributing to peaceful social, economic, and political outcomes.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I mean, that's another excellent question. So I'll start off by saying that Kenneth Boulding's concept of mental representations is conveyed through images generated in minds and later communicated between persons, I think adds to the epistemological undercurrent of entrepreneurial conduct. That is that the standing foundation of Austrian thought. So here, crucially, mental images of anticipated benefits arising from entrepreneurial activity, especially visions of more satisfactory states in the future, help motivate the construction of novel plans and in a manner that's not reducible to stimulus responses towards known variables, which is behavioralist psychology and which is also arguably neoclassical economics. So, although the word entrepreneur is mentioned just once in Boulding's book, The Image, he does articulate a range of concepts in the book and elsewhere that I think are extremely useful in advancing a unique understanding of entrepreneurial functions. So, in essence, and as you've just laid out in your question, the entrepreneur may be interpreted in the Boulding view, I believe, as a creator of images and also as a modifier or reviser of images. So let me just flesh that out a little bit by drawing on some of Boulding's other work. So he published an essay in 1964, which is cited in my RAE paper for those interested. And Boulding says this: the most important property of man's image is his ability to change it. Without this, we may be trapped in images which are self reinforcing, even though they are not self justifying. A generalization of that argument, I think, is that irrespective of the function of entrepreneurship as articulated in Austrian economics and related literature, so agency or judgment or innovation or coordination or alertness and so on, all entrepreneurs possess images in their minds and are amenable to modifying them potentially in radical ways. And as I implied beforehand with respect to my reference to O'Driscoll and Rizzo, my emphasis on the entrepreneur as an image creator is not actually intended to overshadow the contributions, let's say, of Kerzner regarding the error correction propensities of entrepreneurial activity. So, as Kerzner himself recognized in a 1992 book entitled The Meaning of the Market Process, and I quote, creativity and the correction of error need not be mutually exclusive categories. So, the Boolean entrepreneur is therefore, I think, an agent involved in correcting, modifying, or revising existing images regarded by a given individual or like minded set of individuals as being in error, however defined. Note, though, that I added an additional parameter surrounding entrepreneurship and the image because Boulding's entrepreneur poses not only as a creator of images, but as a reviser of images. So there's actually a multi pronged functionality here. So Boulding has a really nice way with words in general, I think. And as a really nice example, I particularly am fond of the following sentence from The Image, his 1956 book, describe what I mean. And I quote, the change in the image comes in mutations through a Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Einstein. So, really, here, I think a conspicuous feature of modern Austrian economics scholarship is the extension of its core theoretical and methodological commitments toward examining non economic phenomena. So, indeed, certain thinkers in the Austrian tradition have applied concepts such as subjectivism, entrepreneurship, epistemic heterogeneity in emergent institutions to a whole range of cultural and social formations and situations. So, in my paper, and as you've just sort of outlined, Chris, I take another step further into this socio-cultural substrand within contemporary Austrian economics to describe the case of peace entrepreneurs. So, I would define peace entrepreneurs as actors operating within and across economic or political, cultural, social environments, and so on, seeking to reduce violent conflict and to advance peaceful outcomes in regional, local, and global contexts. So, for the maybe for the sake of clarity, because I'm mentioning entrepreneurship in a few ways, maybe I'll just refer to peace entrepreneurs as peacemakers, so we can just keep a better focus upon what I believe Boulding scholarship contributes to entrepreneurial studies. Okay, so if I do that, then the question is, well, what's the connection between peacemaking and Boulding entrepreneurship? Well, it's image revisionism that can be seen as part of broader efforts by individuals and groups to contestably, if not contentiously, strive to overcome what they perceive to be image problems that prevail in the world. So, a desire to correct image problems reflect an assessment by these entrepreneurs that prevailing or conventional images embody or otherwise reflect a degree of cognitive misunderstanding or lack of comprehension by others as to how societal arrangements should operate or have effect. So, here, if we have a sufficient lack of peace or an insufficiency of stable peace in the world, a peacemaker can likely venture forth to impress upon others a host of arguments that could aid in image revision within others' minds, hopefully in a more pro peace direction. So, I won't dispute here that it's also possible for peacemakers to engage in aspects of entrepreneurship that involve the origination of entirely new images of peace previously unthought of. Perhaps a good example of that might be the promulgation of fresh mental images that one can glean from, let's say, pro peace, fictional, and other literature. But again, I think just for the sake of argument, I'm wanting to stick with this idea of peacemaking through a revisionist cognitive strain and bullying entrepreneurship. And I don't think this is unreasonable either, because conceivably every person has some preset images surrounding past experiences and future possibilities surrounding peace and war, including in its sort of normative sense. So, as you and some of your listeners might know, Kenneth Boulding was certainly a very active and creative progenitor of a modern intellectual tradition concerning the economics of peace and conflict resolution. So, throughout this paper of mine, I discern a common thread, and that is that Boulding recognized the influence of self precepts and perspectives about others in the weighing of the relative benefits and costs of peace versus war. A key implication of that cognitive orientation to studying peaceful relations is that images that reduce or increase the relative cost of peace or war are not only conducive to prosperity, but are actually morally appropriate from the standpoint of the preservation of human life. It's an obvious point, but it's an important one. An important variable affecting the prevalence of interstate peace or war, for example, is what Boulding described in his later works as, and I quote, images within each country has of itself and of others, which may be inclusive of, I quote, a rough scale of the friendliness or hostility of or toward other nations. So I think in the final analysis, my interest is with how the Boolean function of entrepreneurship as image generation or revision applies to the tasks of peace advocacy and engagement, which is certainly one of the most vital tasks confronting humankind today. And I take the opportunity in the paper to discuss a historical case demonstrating how classical liberal trade activists during the 19th century sought to modify or revise public mental images in ways that would hopefully, and succeeded in some part, reduce hostilities between European nation states.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And let me invite you to say more about that case. Let's move to some concrete names and historical events that illuminate the features of peacemaking and entrepreneurship that you've been talking about here. So in your paper, as you mentioned, you discuss the Manchester School, specifically figures like Richard Cobden and John Bright. And I want to ask you to tell us a little bit more about their work and how it fits in with your framework and illuminates these excellent points you've been making.
Thank you, Chris. That's great. So, Richard Cobden and John Bright, I readily admit they're among my favorite figures throughout the classical liberal intellectual and political tradition, with both figures understanding the immense emancipatory potential of cross border economic exchange relations, together with their capacity to underpin peaceful cosmopolitan relations among humankind. So, I was really excited to actually write about them for the review of Austrian Economics Special Issue and to talk about them even now. So, Cobden and Bright, for those who may not be so familiar, they were 19th century British classical liberals based in Manchester, England, in the county of Lancashire. Both Cobden and Bright came to be leading intellectual figures of the so called Manchester School, a liberal subdoctrine that radically promoted economic liberalism resting upon free trade and the abolition of economic privilege, not only for its own sake, but as a pivotal means to secure peace in the world. So these two peacemakers were central to the founding of one of the most successful liberal political and social movements, the Anti Corn Law League, which advocated the elimination of British agricultural tariffs in an assertive and public campaign that eventually yielded success in 1846 with the parliamentary repeal of the Corn Laws. So, what's the relevance of Comdenite Brightian peacemaking from the Boulding entrepreneurship standpoint? Well, I think that Cobden and Associates sought to generate new and modify existing images to win a groundswell of public support, which would hopefully translate into political concessions for peace. So the imagery of the Manchester School, I argue, focused upon connections between the free trade of commodities across borders and peaceful outcomes among human beings. Both Cobden and Bright were known as very persuasive public speakers, and I can offer many examples of how both communicated images in favor of what is commonly described as the capitalist peace. So, in one public speech, Cobden said, and I'll quote, I see in the free trade principle that which shall act on the moral world as the principle of gravitation in the universe, drawing men together, thrusting aside the antagonism of race and creed and language, and uniting us in the bonds of eternal peace. It's inspiring stuff. And so the economically inclusive and cosmopolitan image of an everyday peace of trading relations were strategically coupled with images critiquing the burdens of the British warfare state and of empire. Cobden and Bright painted an image of extravagance attached to public expenditures, taxes, and borrowings by national governments for so called defense, but probably more appropriately labeled as attack purposes. John Bright had peculiar talents in promulgating value laden messaging that could resonate in the minds of others. In one instance, he connected acts of foreign aggression with the interest of domestic elites when critiquing balance of power and other related images as underpinning what he described as an enormous system of outdoor relief for the aristocratic classes. Such rhetoric was seen as effectively tapping into a groundswell of animosity among working and middle classes against well connected political elites who retained vast privileges, including the ability to capture and retain economic rents through warfare and colonialism. So, as I mentioned, and Bright were very successful in adjusting mental images in a way that made British tariff reform feasible. But it's true to say that the advocates of the Manchester School did face some challenges, particularly as time progressed. Cobden, Bright, and their associates were forced to confront divergent images of peace and war that were carried in the minds of the political class and the public. There were some very much deep seated mental images, especially among political rulers, concerning the desirability of war and colonialism vis a vis peace. So there were clashing images among peace advocates and others that also influence perceptions about the most feasible means of securing peace, with Cobden and other peace entrepreneurs unhappily discovering the absence of guaranteed consensus about how to transition from war to peace. They were able to win the tariff battle, but it was very difficult for them to prevent colonial and empire misadventures elsewhere in Europe and beyond. So, of course, there were many political and economic interests who felt an incentive in perpetuating colonialism and interstate war, interests that would have been colored with, let's say, mental images of nationalistic glory seeking and other values inimical to securing peace with distant others. So you can see here where Cobden and Bright, as Boolean peace entrepreneurs, were struggling with other ideational entrepreneurs to gain some sort of image laden ascendancy in the minds of the public. So, look, I mean, it can be argued that the political effectiveness of the Manchester School in permanently securing peace outcomes was mixed. Certainly, since the 1846 British tariff reforms, but I still think a strong case, a reasonable case, can be made that Cobden, Bright, and other liberal peace proponents did succeed in entrepreneurially laying out ideational logics for the period of relative prosperity and tranquility that followed during the Victorian era. Frank Trentman wrote a very useful book in 2008 entitled Free Trade Nation, wherein he argued that British trade liberalisation contributed to a period of dominance regarding images linking peace with trade. The British public image, in other words, evolved in a direction more amenable, at least in degree, to the liberal pace, the liberal capitalist pace on Manchesterian terms. At the very least, I think the continuing intellectual interest and reverence among classical liberals, libertarians, and certain peace advocates for Manchester school ideas, otherwise known as Cobdenism, actually attests to the distinctiveness of this strand of peace entrepreneurship within the broad realm of ideas.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things I really like about your paper is the multiple margins of contributions, I'll call it. It advances our understanding of Boulding's ideas in and of themselves, I would argue. In doing so, it also advances Austrian economics. You've highlighted the connections there. And if that wasn't enough, you also bring in this wonderful work by Cobden and Brighton. Of course, I share your admiration for these thinkers, as you know. And so it touches upon all these different strands, but all ties them together into this really powerful conceptual apparatus that has real world implications. And so where I want to conclude our conversation, if you're open to discussing it, is to talk a little bit about where you see some opportunities for subsequent scholarship that is motivated by this conception of peace entrepreneurship, grounded in Boulding, drawing upon the Austrians, illustrated by the Manchester School, but presumably has a significant number of other applications and extensions. If you'd be willing, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thanks for your retrospective on the paper too. I really, really do appreciate that. So, look, I actually happen to think that the concept of building entrepreneurship as the origination and modification of mental representations or images has so much applicability, not only for peace studies but for social science. So, I think that one of the more useful ways that Boulding's concept of the image can be used to study peacemaking is just by examining additional case studies. There are potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of examples at varying scales from local interactions through to national, if not global interactions, in which rhetoric and other forms of communication have been used in an entrepreneurial fashion to bring forth new and revised images in favor of peaceable relations. So, peacemaking or peace entrepreneurship, if you will, can conceivably involve every human being gracing the face of this earth, as you, Chris, have perceptively articulated with your concept of pax hominum or everyday peace that entails, in the end, people of diverse backgrounds, experiences, and identities interacting peacefully and resolving conflicts without resorting to violence. So I would expect that studies from ancient and modern history, together with analyses of the present, would reveal so many and perhaps surprising ways in which people have attempted to project peaceful images interpersonally and publicly. So, as also mentioned earlier, although Cobden and Bright were successful Baldian entrepreneurs with respect to the anti tariff argument, they were arguably not so successful in pressing for avoidance of conflict with great powers such as Russia during the 19th century. So, I think it's entirely possible for future research to also examine the effectiveness of image making by peace entrepreneurs. Peacemakers, unfortunately, may not always succeed in changing personal and public images surrounding the benefits of peace and non-violence against the cost of war and violence, given widespread and deeply ingrained beliefs in the superior moral or technical capability of the state in upholding the peace. So, in your own work, Chris, there's that contrastive image, if I could put it that way, of Pax Imperii, of government as the guarantor of peace, order, and stability. This is a Hobbesian idea that still looms large over the mental consciousness of the public today. Even, I would argue, such images have been maliciously abused to excuse warfare and violence of the state. So I think a very interesting question is to think about how it is that, from our perspective, the obviousness of the image of peace sometimes struggles during various cycles or periods in time against this clamor for the destructiveness of and violence of warfare. So I think underpinning those kind of concerns, I think, is an interest in the salient question as to what makes certain images favoring peace or maybe even war, what makes these images stick. So in 2007, authors Chip and Dan Heath wrote a very interesting book entitled Made to Stick, the subtitle, Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. So they say that to make an idea or an image salient, the principle should be as follows. An idea should be, or an image should be relatively simple for others to understand. It should contain some element of ideational surprise, perhaps through counterintuitive reasoning that still makes sense. A useful image that has persistent properties will be one that has concreteness or a persistence of an idea to make it last in someone's mind. Also, another principle is that a good image or a good idea or a useful one is that provides a credible image that is believable to other people. And there's also notions that images that tie to emotional elements can enable one to register the significance or urgency of an image or an idea. And finally, Heath and Heath suggests that the potential for an image to be woven into a decent narrative that inspires action is also more likely to be successful than others. So I detect certain elements of the Heath and Heath classifications not only in Boulding's work, but in Hayek's psychological setup. The basic point here is to encourage others to use Boulding's concepts, perhaps in productive engagements with other viewpoints such as Hayek and beyond, to help bring about accurate and sober understandings about the contextual influences upon winning the piece or any other application you can conceive of. So I think in the end, to wrap up, I think there are many potential ways to build up a scholarship inspired by Boulding to investigate aspects of peace and the role of human agency to motivate others to bring forth peaceful change. As long as people remain free to associate, speak, and express their views, I'm quite confident that Boulding and entrepreneurs can develop new and refined images of a more peaceful world that will persuade and resonate. I don't think it's overreaching to claim either that Boulding inspired, image oriented peace entrepreneurship is needed really more urgently now than at any other time in living memory.
Thank you so much. The title of the paper is Kenneth Boulding's The Image, a Cognitive Basis for Peace Entrepreneurship. This is part of a special issue on the thought of Kenneth Boulding that is going to appear in the Review of Austrian Economics. The author of the paper, who I've been speaking with today, is Mikayla Novak. And Mikayla, thank you so much for both writing the paper, but for spending time with me discussing its core ideas, themes, and opportunities for future scholarship.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure as always.
Today, I am joined by Anna Claire Flowers. Anna Claire is a PhD student in economics here at George Mason University and a graduate fellow with the F.A. Hayek program. Anna Claire, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm especially happy to have you here because we are discussing our joint co-authored project together. And this is part of, just to situate it, it's part of a larger initiative that we're involved in with the Hayek program, exploring the work of the Bouldings, Kenneth Boulding and Elise Boulding, particularly as it pertains to issues of peace. And our project together, as part of this, which will appear in a special issue of the Review of Austrian Economics, is titled "The Family and the Stable Peace." And so, to begin, let me ask you to discuss the core argument that we develop in the paper, and especially how it relates broadly to the work of the Bouldings, Kenneth and Elise.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll start by just kind of a lot of the listeners might know about the Boldings, but Kenneth and Elise Boulding together, their work as an economist and political scientist, they regard peace as a process rather than a state of affairs. So that's kind of our starting point. This process of peace mostly occurs at the individual level where people interact and they experiment and they just, through their day to day lives, understand and learn how to live peaceably together. So, Elise Molding likes to refer to peaceableness as a skill or competency that is held at the individual level rather than peace as kind of a macro state of affairs. And the core thesis of our paper is that the family is a main setting for developing peacefulness in individuals.
Yeah, so that's great because I think you nailed a really important part there that I want to spend a little bit more time talking about. On the one hand, both Ken Boulding and Elise Boulding emphasize that peace makes no sense to talk about absent individual action. So it's grounded ultimately in individuals, but at the same time, individuals are grounded in a variety of different social arrangements, organizations, and so on, family being one of them. And so it's interesting to think about that interplay between the individual and the environment or different environments within which they are embedded. And so to dive a little bit more into the context of the family, we talk about three categories or activities that occur in the family environment that are important for developing these skills of peace. So can you talk a little bit about those activities and why they matter?
Yeah. We get this language that we use in the paper of relational capacities and peacemaking skills and peaceable attitudes from a Learning for Peace initiative that was done actually by UNICEF. So a UN initiative for children. They're trying to actually implement peace building, peacemaking skills and attitudes and competencies in kind of their school programs around the world, particularly in places that maybe are known to have more conflict and violence. So we borrow from their list of just knowledge, skills, attitudes that they're wanting to kind of invest in at an early age. Another thing for context is that one of the features of the Bolding's work that I really love is that they pay attention to where peace is occurring and not just where it's absent. So we want to just follow that example and pay attention to the things that kind of are going well in order to develop peaceableness. So yeah, kind of going through that list and how we structure our argument, we start out with how families develop relational capacities. And this is an activity that can be more broadly defined as just nurture or nurturance, but we get a little more specific with it to talk about some of these skills or really relational capacities, to use that language, such as interdependence or reciprocity. So, and in talking about this, we benefit from the vast amount of research done in developmental psychology that just really describes the earliest interpersonal interactions between parents and children as powerfully shaping a person's expectations on the nature of other interpersonal relationships throughout life. So, in our earliest and neediest years, we hopefully experience reliance on caregivers, which leads to trust. So I can't feed myself, I can't carry myself around for, several months. And eventually you kind of learn to rely and experience that interdependence is a fact of life. And it goes without saying that this can be really painful when there is not a trustworthy caretaker involved to meet those needs in early life, right? So, like I said, some of the relational capacities developed in this very early stage are capacities for interdependence, reciprocity, even, before a baby is 1 year old, they're learning to smile when someone smiles at them, that kind of thing. So, this can start very young. The second one is we talk about learning peacemaking skills. So, of course, there are a lot of many influential adults in a child's life, ideally, maybe teachers, coaches, neighbors, extended family members, other community members. But we make the point that parents and family caregivers have the relevant, or at least the largest kind of stock of relevant knowledge and incentives to invest in their child's peacemaking skills. So these are things like communication, teamwork, empathy, negotiation, self-awareness. I'm spending, the most time with that child, and also their attitudes and their behavior really reflects on my own reputation. I have a lot of incentives to invest in those skills in my kids, and you're a parent, so you may be able to speak to this. The third one is practicing peaceable attitudes, and that one's a really simple point. We draw on just the fact that even if you think about game theory, a game is different whenever there's a repeated interaction or there's the expectation that the interaction will be repeated. So the fact that family life is day in and day out, so many interactions, and anyone who's lived with anyone knows that we kind of have to move on from things when conflict arises and really work through it in order to live a happy and enjoyable life together. So the point there is just really that family settings provide a lot of practice for overcoming conflict and developing attitudes that are kind of more in that category of trust, self respect, tolerance, open mindedness, that kind of thing. You really learn to put yourself in another's shoes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And just to you mentioned this, but to be clear to the for the people listening, of course, the argument isn't that, a family is some kind of panacea that automatically, always and everywhere leads to peace promoting behaviors. There can be dysfunction, there can be a variety of issues with families that don't create that environment. But the point is that it is one important context where peace learning oftentimes does take place through kind of the channels that you just highlighted for us.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing about civil society, which is that when one kind of node of civil society falls short or fails, then others step in. And so, yeah, it's certainly not the only place where nurturance can occur. Certainly not the only place where that kind of practice and conflict resolution can occur. And hopefully we see other entities kind of stepping in to fill those gaps. But certainly in a lot of cases, a really important setting.
Yeah, so that you're right, and you're exactly right. There's the biological family, and that's obviously important for many people. But then there's these other aspects of life that they're involved in, as you mentioned, sports, church, a whole host of different things in people's daily lives, and there's numerous examples of those non-biological kind of relationships taking on certain features that you can almost envision being family-like, how people conceptualize a family. So we have this idea of the family environment broadly understood as a a training ground. It's an environment where people can learn and cultivate skills. And as you mentioned, there's repeated interactions going on that allow people to develop these skills. I want to ask you about this concept that Kenneth Boulding talks about, especially in his book Stable Peace, about the taboo line. Talk a little bit about what that is, the taboo line, but also how the family as a training ground influences how family members cultivate a variety of skills, things like responsibility, tolerance, and so on, that can influence that taboo line.
Yeah, yeah, the stable piece is a big inspiration for this paper. It's in the title. And part of that sort of main argument is that conflict is ubiquitous, it's unavoidable. And so what do we do when we are faced with it? Does it have to necessarily devolve into violence? Or can at that point of decision between how to handle the conflict, can we, sort of practice taking the route that then is nonviolent, that's peaceful? So that kind of point of decision is kind of how I understand the taboo line. I know, I mean, I think the answer to this would be different for everyone. Like, how do the day-to-day activities of family life contribute to kind of broader nonviolent conflict resolution? I guess a couple of examples really are just, like I said, with parents or close caregivers, just having such a large amount of time together, something like discipline or sort of training. Early when kids are small and I interact with friends' kids a lot, it's like, there really is kind of a third party in a lot of those conflict situations. Someone has to comfort the child, someone has to resolve the argument between siblings or come in and say, "What are we fighting about?" So there is sort of a, like I said, those adults in the situation sort of have the relevant knowledge and also incentives. This is disrupting their environment. They're gonna go and kinda help resolve that moment of conflict. So I think you see it modeled really closely. You're actually taught, okay, we don't take, the other your brother's toy, he's using it right now, and then whenever he's done using it, you can have it, that kind of thing. So a lot of it is just very kind of hands-on instructive. And then to that point of repeated dealings, repeated interactions. I mean, it's kind of funny to describe family relationships that way, but it's something that it's like we are tied together, hopefully, things haven't gone wrong enough to say, I'm never going to see this person again. We're tied together in some way where there's going to be a family event, even if we're all grown up and moved on from that immediate household. There's going to be things that bring us back together. I think at the taboo line, when you're deciding, is this worth it to continue that relationship? The fact that there's that ongoing just tie between people and ongoing commitment really makes it worthwhile to figure out what that strategy is to overcome the conflict peacefully. So, like I said, I think it would be different for everyone, and I'm sure very different around the world. But those two things, as far as, having it modeled for you when you really don't know how to handle that conflict situation, kind of having that mentorship from family members, and then also just the bonds that you have that make it worthwhile to figure out. a peaceful strategy that's sustainable. Whereas if you don't kind of have that tie with someone, or you don't know that you're going to be living in proximity or community with them, then you have lesser incentives to kind of work together to find out what works.
Yeah, a couple interesting points that occurred to me as you were responding to that, which I greatly appreciate. So we have this idea of taboo. So the things that are kind of off limits. The way Boulding puts it at one point, Kenneth Boulding, is these are actions that are physically possible, but don't enter into our realm of thought at a moment in time. So just in plain language, we could physically hit each other when we have a disagreement, but for most people, most of their interactions with people, the idea of hitting someone physically doesn't enter into their thought when they have a disagreement with them. That's the point in the broad sense. So then it's, well, how do you learn this and internalize it? And you raise some great points. So we have, well, one is there can be kind of formal intervention. So, especially when you're younger, some people when they're old, I guess some people never outgrow this, unfortunately. They need someone to come in and kind of hold their hand to help them navigate the situation. That's one, and that's learning. Another is observational, I would say, which is you can observe either your guardians or your siblings or just people that are older than you or even the same age, it doesn't have to be older per se, how they navigate conflict situations. And that's another form of modeling. It's not even that you need to be directly in the conflict situations, but you see how they handle things and navigate things. And then the other really fascinating thing with kids, if you watch them, is they figure stuff out even at a relatively young age. They figure out various ways of navigating things. Sometimes they hit each other. That's why I have to teach them not to hit each other. They do also come up with kind of heuristics for turn taking and sharing and, all right, you get to decide this game and I'll decide the next game, or I'll play this role this game and but you get that cherished role next game, whatever it is. And so that's the really fascinating, I think, micro level stuff is really easy to overlook because it's mundane and we just ignore it most of the time. We actually, the interesting point is we tend to focus on the hitting and taking people's stuff rather than, oh, look, a majority of the time they're actually cooperative and peaceful.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it may be it may be loud, it may be, the negotiations are, maybe childlike, but they're happening, and they're figuring out how to cooperate. They're figuring out, yeah, okay, I'll like you said, I'll give this up this time, but I get to do it next time. And that really translates. I think it really does translate to your expectations for adult relationships too.
Yeah, and the other thing I just wanted to touch upon, going back to what we said about families not being a panacea, you can also learn from things that don't work. So families shape you, and there's plenty of people who have experienced things in life in their own upbringing, and then they'll say things like, "Well, when I have my own family, I want to do X, Y, or Z differently because I don't want to replicate that." So that's always a form of learning, or can be a form of learning as well. I want to now turn as we're heading down the home stretch here from, we've talked about individuals, we talked about the family environment. Now let's kind of move to the kind of broader step, if you will, which is you have these internal family interactions and learning processes where you're developing these peacemaking capabilities. How do those translate outside the home in the Boulding's way of thinking to a broader stable piece or unstable piece for that matter?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think again, this is context specific, but I mean, and we're sort of economists, talking about developmental psychology and sort of reflecting on our own experiences to some extent here. But one thing that really comes to mind is just all the things that are required for an exchange economy, right? So trust, reciprocity, interdependence. And it doesn't mean, Hayek's point is that we don't have to treat everyone that we interact with in an economy as we would family, right? There's a limited kind of level of knowledge that we have, or level of even emotion that we have to connect with everyone that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. But still, those skills and attitudes that are developed in a very hopefully safe and stable environment, or like you said, kind of observed and the absence of those things maybe and they go a different direction. Those capacities are totally drawn upon in every exchange interaction. So just even as we look at, we want to see the global economy thriving and it takes a lot of peace to be able to do that, right? It takes a lot of good relations to be able to exchange with others and it even we know that exchange can even contribute to that too, but just kind of the point that without some of those formative interactions we might not be able to kind of contribute socially and economically. You start to see them as really consequential, these relational capacities, the self-awareness and empathy that's required for living in the home but also interacting in the broader world.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's fascinating because, again, you start thinking about these little micro level interactions between peaceful people that occur peacefully, and a lot of them are mundane. So they're not world changing interactions. But one of the aspects of the Boldings I appreciate in their discussions of peace is, and it's a very Austrian type point, which is that that when Austrians or and this is Hayek, this is Mises, James Buchanan, when they talk about the market, they say, look, it makes no sense to talk about the market absent the process that generates it, all the interactions between people. And their conception, they being the Boldings, their conception of peace is very analogous to that, which is we tend to look at a society or we look down at it and say that's peaceful or violent. And there's something to that. But at the same time, what they're emphasizing is if we really want to understand both peace at a point in time, but also change through time, kind of phases of more or less peace, movements, if you will, then we have to look at the processes that generate those. And those processes are ultimately traced back to the actions of individuals. And then where we observe peacemaking, that assumes there's certain skills that either exist or are being developed. And so you can see kind of, as you put it quite nicely, how these interactions scale up in a way, not in an additive way. It's not a simple A plus B equals C, but in a way of contributing to a broader complex networks of social interactions.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that when we see, voluntary associations and exchange as a whole kind of targeted by, central planning or the likes. I mean, in the same way that the market system, the price system is replaced with a central decision maker, a lot of these other personal associations are targeted too. And it's so interconnected when you look at the historical cases, which is a conversation for another time, of what happens in centrally planned economies to, the other interpersonal relationships and associations that really our society is built on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. In closing, I want to ask you a broader question about your research beyond this paper. This paper being one part of your research portfolio. You've developed as a graduate student a fascinating research program around the economics and political economy of the family. And I was hoping, I realize this is a broad question to answer in a short period of time, but I was wondering if you could give listeners a little bit of insight into your broader research program because it flows nicely in connection with this one paper, but this paper is only a small part of it. So tell us a little bit about your research more broadly.
Yeah, no, thank you. It really relates to what I was just saying about once you once you see that in the same way that there are individual participants in the market system to have the relevant subjective knowledge and incentives to buy and sell and trade and make just goal-oriented decisions for themselves that contributes to a broader market system that we all get to benefit from. In the same way, there are people who have relevant knowledge and incentives about sort of coordinating a household And so, in a kind of comparative sense, I really enjoy studying, when government entities or even other forms of kind of coercion come in and kind of replace some of the functions that were typically assigned to members of a household or family members. Just what is lost in that substitution is a lot of local knowledge. And so whether it's childcare is what my dissertation is about, it's kind of a few different case studies, one of them being COVID, on what happened when, a lot of the other members who are typically involved in the care and education of children kind of dropped out of the scene due to a global pandemic, and who was there to pick up the pieces and who had the relevant knowledge to pick things up and keep going, who had the incentives to keep showing up. And that was, for the most part, again, we're speaking in kind of generalizations here, that was parents and family members and extended family members even, and that paper shows like a pattern of, in economic crises, families tend to expand their number of activities that they're responsible for. Maybe the market isn't as available to them in those situations, but it really shows that they're capable of kind of expanding and contracting and using the local knowledge that they have to meet needs in a way that is just more effective than anyone else who could come in and step in that situation. So, I like to see, to kind of draw the parallel between, yeah, you have to have local knowledge coordinating the price system, and in a large part, you have to have local knowledge sort of coordinating the development and, yeah, raising and education of children in a large sense. And there's just something that a lot of things can be outsourced, but not everything can. So, kind of taking the knowledge and incentives that we see at play in the market and looking at where else those are highly relevant.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. The title of the paper that we discussed today is The Family and the Stable Peace. Anna Claire, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.